Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 35 of IGEL Weekly. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I've got Chris Feeney with me, as always. Chris, how's it going?
Going well. 35. Man, we're getting old.
35.
This is great. You lose track of these things. So I'm doing well, man. How are you?
Good. For those listening, we're almost up to 100 on the Citrix podcast that we do. I think I skipped yesterday, but we moved it, I think, to later in the week. Actually, I think we're going to talk about IGEL and Citrix later in the week.
We are. We got some good stuff to talk about. Look forward to that one on Friday.
Yeah. And you know, our listenership's growing. We love it if you guys would promote this some more. And look, we're going to get these in the can. We're going to release some on YouTube as well in the coming months. And then we'll just keep doing it. I mean, I saw a post on Facebook, Barry over at Control Up, Barry Flanagan. Winners aren't people who win. They're people who don't quit. I don't know. I think I screwed that up. But at the end of the day, it's people who just keep going. If it's something you believe in, you just keep doing it. And that's kind of the goal of some of these podcasts, right? Just keep doing it because it's the right thing to do. And eventually you'll be successful to a degree where it matters.
Absolutely. Fall down 9, get up 10, right?
That's right.
Keep going. There's all kinds of analogies there.
So this week we're doing a community blog review. And so that means we have Seb with us. Seb, how's it going?
Quite good. I'm coming back from vacation, spent a lot of time in D-Day related historical places in the north of France, in Normandy. So I'm re-energized. I'm back. You told me that. And then you went to Netherlands, right?
Yes. So spent a lot of time up in Normandy there. Well, not a lot. It was a short few days, but to be able to book an Airbnb right on Omaha Beach, that was amazing and humbling, actually. But yeah, we could talk about that one. We wrote a blog on that.
So is that what you guys do?
Cover more than an hour.
So you guys typically go like sightseeing and stuff for your vacations, or is it a combination between that and sitting on a beach? What's vacation look like for you guys?
On my side, this one was really special because I never went to the specific place, and I never was in the north of France, to be absolutely honest. Because if you're coming from France, you know that the north of France is mostly rain, snow in the summer. No, just kidding. Not that bad, but it's really a cold place usually and really cloudy. But usually I'm spending a lot of time at museums and going hitchhiking and all that stuff. In that specific case, it was really a historical approach.
I'm sorry, you just said hitchhiking?
Yeah. I know. I'm getting older. Or is it not the right term?
Hiking.
I don't know.
Hitchhiking is putting your thumb out, waiting for somebody to come pick you up. Is that what you did?
Okay, no, that's right. That was a long time ago.
Lost in translation.
I know in Europe, I think things are maybe in certain areas a little safer, more safe than they are here in the US. But yeah, you're putting these days, I do have a friend that hitchhiked across the country a couple of years ago, trying to prove that the country wasn't as bad as we all think it is and politically divided as we all think it is. And he just would hitchhike and get in the car and just talk to people about what they thought.
And he is still alive?
Yeah, he's still alive. He actually is the guy that I'm putting in charge of the nonprofit that we've started to kind of do the eliminate.
It wasn't a question of how was it. It was is he still alive?
He did make it home. And he's a gun carrying American. I don't think he actually had his gun with him for that trip though. He would just put his hands in his faith and off he went.
Nice. To your question, Andy, I think, we've done sort of add some historical things to the vacation. When we went to France a couple of years ago, it was 2019. And I'd like to say I planned this all out, but it was not. It was, we had rough places that we wanted to get to and Airbnbs and all that stuff. So the framework was there. The things that were unexpected were our last night in Paris, we're eating dinner. Funny thing, I couldn't speak French. My daughter could, but she was nervous about ordering in French. The guy spoke Spanish, so I ordered a French meal in Spanish. Turns out the folks next to us spoke Spanish. That had a nice conversation. Well, then we see some lights over there, and it's the I think the Trocadero or something like that right there. It looks out on the Eiffel Tower, and it turns out Fox Sports was broadcasting for the Women's U.S. Cup World Game, and so we go there, and they the producer sees we're Americans, and we're like, hey, at halftime they're going to come down in this little spot. Would you mind standing behind the hosts? So we did, and it was Alexi Leilas and all those folks, and so I texted my buddy whose daughters play soccer. I was like, hey, dude, I think we're on TV, and he sent me a picture of us on TV. It's awesome. And then we went up there to Normandy, and you know, we kind of threw it. It turns out it was like a band of brothers, sort of. We went to the places where they fought, and then we ended up working our way with a vehicle. So it was, you know, a lot of that was you know, somewhat planned out, but not purposely. It all kind of came together when we got there, so it was kind of cool.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Got to get that trip on the list. I take my family hitchhiking usually hiking, and then we mix in some time sitting on a beach or something somehow.
We should try that. All family, we're going hitchhiking. What, Dad?
Yeah.
You got to be kidding me.
You have to wait. I've got
a life skill.
I'd have to wait for
life
a van. I have to wait for a big conversion van to go by just to be able to fit.
That's right.
Well,
Awesome.
guys, Seb has brought with him a blog to review today, which is awesome. Glad he does that. I think it's by one of the community members, Barry Brown. Seb, you want to kind of set us up for what we're going to talk about here?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks to Barry for writing that article, because it was based on a request he had on the Agile community. And he had the request to access a specific component of our Agile ecosystem without having the ability to access the physical virtual machine. So explaining it myself, we have a couple
Seb,
of...
sorry to interrupt, but it's from October 21st, and the title, before we get too far, is How to Access the IGEL UMS, Universal Management Server or Suite? What's the S stand for? Suite.
Yeah, but in that case, and going into the article itself, it's really the UMS administrator, because obviously you could also access the console via SSH, but that doesn't make usually so much sense since we have the UMS web app now installed more or less by default in our UMS. So it's really accessing the UMS administrator. So the specific piece of administrative.
Seb, let me just get the title out. How to access the IGEL UMS administrator console with only SSH access. All right, now go. Sorry.
Yeah. No issue. So we have the UMS console, which is the console you're looking at if you want to manage your endpoints. And then you have a second component, which is called the UMS administrator, which is really neat, I guess, in most of our customer base, one time after the initial install, if you are planning to do a change of your network port or your database. But if you don't plan to do that, you will never open that tool again. But that specific tool is really important if you want to access your database settings. So if you plan to migrate from the embedded database to an external one, like an example, that's a tool where you're looking at. You cannot do that via the UMS console.
Hey, Seb, so to be clear, we're talking a slight deviation in the word here. We have the administrator console versus the administration console. Give me the two names of the two consoles again.
So the administrator is really the main administration tool for the UMS server, for the server component. And then we have our IGEL UMS console, which is the standard console you are using for shadowing your endpoint, deploying profiles, so what you are using on a daily basis. The other one, the administrator, the IGEL UMS administrator, is really an administrative tool that we are using only for administrative tasks.
And for most people, if they have access to the virtual machine, they're going to log in to the virtual machine and do it from within there. But what Barry's provided here is how you can SSH into that world. Is that right?
Yes. So basically, let's imagine we are, and that's something that we didn't mention until now, but I mean, it's quite obvious if you speak about SSH and the Ubuntu machine, we are speaking about a Linux-based Universal Management Suite server. So if you speak about the UMS, you can install the UMS on Windows, which is obvious, but you can also install it on a Linux machine. And that Linux machine is in a standard way deployed on your on-prem server system or maybe on a cloud-based system. So in that specific case, I guess you use AWS. So the machine is not stored locally, and he reduced the amount of communication possibilities to that to that machine to just a small piece of SSH. And SSH is really accessing in a standard way via command line some components of your server operating system or an application installed on it. But you cannot access, let's say, a graphical user interface by using SSH without doing some little tweaks. And that's what we are covering right now. So we are not only covering the Linux IGEL approach, but also more general, how can I access a graphical user interface through SSH on Linux.
Okay. So where do we need to go from here? I think you've done a good job setting up the concept. Do we want to jump into Barry's blog and kind of talk through what he did?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, if you think about what Barry did, he did that on AWS. So you might not have exactly the same approach if you are using Linux operating system installed on another hypervisor like VMware View, or on VMware ESXi or on XenTegra. It's really something which is really specific to AWS or on Azure. So if you go there, you have usually the ability to configure an SSH client for your Linux machine. And that's how you will gather information, how to start your local, assuming you're using Windows, a tool called PuTTY, so PuTTY, which is the, let's say, most common tool for connecting a remote machine to your server.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically the screenshot where we are looking at. It's about gathering the server name, gathering the username you are using for connecting your SSH client. And that's where we start. So assuming you did that, so you have already an SSH daemon, which is the service which is running on the remote server to accept an incoming connection already configured, and it's already working. You have now to think of what would happen if I would have to open a tool like we do on the UMS administrator, which is graphical. So you open the tool and you should then see a normal window with your database information, all that stuff, but via command line. And that's where the X redirection is coming in. Mm. So let's imagine going back a step backward, you have a physical access to that Linux machine. So it's really in front of you, it's on your local hypervisor. You will open the server console and you will access the whole desktop. That's one way. So you have your local desktop and you have there an X server. The X server is, I'm not a Linux expert, so I will try to explain it with my own words. An X server is basically doing the graphical user interface rendering of what is happening behind. So if you have a window, you have an X and Y position of that window. You have a foreground or background of that window. So you have different windows going between each other. So you have to use a tool which is managing that window position. And that's what the X server is doing. Not only that, but it's one part of its job. And this X11 is something which is enabled if you're deploying a Ubuntu workstation, or if you're using whatever as Linux Mint distribution you're using privately, you have already an X server there. Because
I just had a flashback. I just had a flashback to freshman year in college before Windows showed up on campus and everything was Unix based. Mm-hmm. As you started talking through the X Windows, I think is what it really was then, I believe. But anyway, I think I'm following you. I think a lot of people of my age probably have a clue what you're talking about as well.
I hope so. So if not, just feel free to ask me or please ask me to rephrase my explanation, but that's my explanation of it. And so now that we do not have physical access to that server anymore, but the server is somewhere on-prem on the cloud, you just have an SSH access, which is usually more than enough to do command line stuff. But now you need really a window. So how can I redirect that window, which is started on the remote server, to my local SSH client? Which doesn't have to be PuTTY, but in that case, since we are expecting that most of our users are using Windows as a client, that's what we are covering here with Barry. So if
and real quick, yeah, most of your admins out there are used to running UMS on Windows, and they probably all know, just like the three of us do, that the better future for that is to run it on Linux, where it's more cost effective and more secure. But then you get into a world where it's uncharted waters for a lot of people who grew up in a graphical Windows world. And here we are. And thanks to Barry for putting this together.
Yeah, exactly. So in the case where you want to follow that route, you will have to deal with an SSH client. This SSH client, like I said, PuTTY, which is, if I remember right, free to use. I'm not sure about the licensing, but I guess it was open source, but I will have to double check that. So you download that small Excel, you enter your server name, a port, your username and a password, and you have access via SSH to your Linux machine. That's the basic job of what PuTTY is doing.
You're on the beachhead at that point.
Yeah, right. So that's the perfect use case. But then if you want to use something which is based on a graphical user interface, you have to cover two pieces of the configuration. One piece is on the server side, and that's where now we are coming back to Barry's blog article. The SSH daemon, so the service which is holding the server component for SSH, is relying on a config file. A config file where you're able to set stuff like which user is able and allowed to join the session. Which port do I want to use? Usually it's 22, but you can change it to something else. So basically, this SSHD_config is the configuration tool for your SSH service. So be careful with that, because if you are misconfiguring something there, you might not have access anymore to your server. But that's another topic. So that's the masterpiece of your SSH configuration. And a small part of that configuration is how should the SSH server deal with X11 interactions. And that's the small screenshot that you are seeing in Barry's post, where we enable the X11 forwarding. So we change it from no to yes. We change the X11 display offset and a few other things, but the most important part is the X11 forwarding change from no to yes. If that one is done, I would recommend to restart your SSH daemon. So that's something which is usually done by systemctl restart SSHD or just SSH. And that will reload the configuration file. So then you are done from the server side, basically. But now you want to start the tool via PuTTY, and you will enter, that's what Barry just entered in the blog article, you will start a specific shell file, which is rmadmin.sh. So what you could do there is just saying, okay, you do sudo and then opening the path to your SSH file, and it will open the tool. But
except for our non-Linux Unix folks, sudo means what?
Oh, yeah, right. So if you want to open a tool in a specific context, you will have applications which are running in the user context, which are not using elevated rights. You will just start it, and that's good. But if your tool, your shell file, your binary is needing access to elevated rights, you will have to start in a root context. Starting in the root context could be done by switching the user, by putting SU and switch to the root user, but that might be quite, let's say, unsecured, because you don't want to do everything in the root context. And on the other hand, you don't want to give your root password to everyone. That's the reason why you are using sudo, which says, even if I'm logging in with Sebastien into my Linux machine, I will have the ability to execute specific commands in the super user context, which is meant by sudo. So you are doing something in a root context without being yourself a root user.
And this is why my Unix friends that then became Linux friends back when I was 25 years old used to make fun of me for being a Windows administrator.
Yeah.
Right.
That's another topic.
now in Windows world, you have to at least right click if you haven't turned this off and say, run as administrator in order to get something similar. But that's the translation for our Windows folks here. It's
Yeah.
like right-clicking, run as administrator kind of stuff.
Exactly.
So
Everybody's an admin. Sorry.
hopefully.
Well, not an admin. That's the whole point. But at one point in world of Windows, pretty much everybody was an admin. Go ahead.
So
Sorry,
the-
Seb.
No, oh, good. So the issue is, as soon as you start this this comment in your putty after reloading the X11 forwarding, you would just have a blinking cursor and nothing else, because the application will still get started on your endpoint, but you do not have an X server, properly spoken, which is accessible for that tool. So that sounds complicated, but it isn't. You have to install a small piece of software, which is called, I guess it was covered a little bit later on, XMing. So XMing installed, which is just on the after the putty configuration. I just made a hiccup in my head with the order, but the XMing is an X server that you can install on your Windows machine, and which is then accessible by your putty client. So that's just a small piece of software which enables the applications that you start on Linux to be rendered, to be shown on the display. If you go just a little bit down,
Well, and to translate from what I was talking about earlier, back in the Unix days, right? You had X Windows. This allows X Windows to be remotely accessed from the endpoint device.
Yeah. Perfect explanation, right? So that's what he just covered there, just a little bit over there. So just go back a little bit up. Just a little bit up. Yeah, right. So he just write, note that we have XMing installed and X11 configured on both on the server. That's the XMing I was searching for.
Mm-hmm.
So now you have the X server installed on your endpoint, and you can, yeah.
Well, I was gonna say, it looks like you, so now that we have XMing installed and X11 configured on the server and on the client, now is when he's gonna launch the window remotely.
Right. And I just forgot to mention one thing, because I was still on the X server side, but in your putty configuration, that's the screenshot just a little bit above the XMing, right? Exact. So you have the function which needs to be enabled in some installation. It's already enabled by default, but you have to enable the X11 forwarding on the client side too, so that the server and the client side are both aware that they have to render X11 information that are coming back. And that's it. And that's what we are seeing on the last screenshots. We are now seeing this little Java tool, which I mentioned at the beginning, which is then rendered on your endpoint by using SSH without having the need to have a physical access to the virtual machine console itself.
Mm-hmm. This is great. This is essentially what we have been doing forever in remotely accessing, Windows apps running on a server, somewhere else. But now we're doing it and accessing it from an SSH connection that is enabled to launch the graphical remoting capabilities to access it remotely from a endpoint somewhere, and probably extremely efficient based on the lightweightness of the whole thing.
And just one thing, because we just covered the Windows part, but it's obviously the same for Linux. On most Linux distributions, and honestly, I cannot even find one where it's not installed by default. You have an SSH client, which is installed by default, which is just the binary code SSH. And if you want to start the SSH client in an X11 mode, so he is able to render that information, it was SSH minus or major or uppercase X to redirect the informations, if I remember right.
So Seb, everybody should just run Linux on their endpoint. This would be easy.
Yeah, that's even easier.
And Seb, I forwarded you an email with an attachment that you'll see it here in a second. This is basically summarizing in no graphic, no pictures, but basically walking through the similar steps that Barry outlined. This came from Ron Nair. If you want to do this would be a nice little how-to guide.
Yeah, I just paused my screen and I'm going to pull that up and then I'll unpause here.
But to what Seb was just saying, for example, when you run it, he has got on the second page there the SSH-X command. there's a little note there. If you're having slow connections, you can add a C for compression as well. And then the two options for either the remote admin or remote manager. So, but it should map more or less to what Barry wrote out in his blog as well.
Is Chris, is this available on the IGEL support site or somewhere?
This is actually, we keep it in a learning library. So it's in, we sync that up with some our partners that we share this with. But I think Ron has probably already shared it out there on the community. I'm certain of that.
Okay.
We could probably find it.
Let me just give our listeners the name of it. It's IGEL technology hyphen Linux UMS and X11 forwarding to IGEL OS endpoint. So if you're looking to go find that, that's what you would search for.
Yeah. So whether you follow Barry's blog or want to test out running IGEL Linux or Linux on a server and then just, hammer this out, you've got step-by-step instructions on how to do that. So.
Okay. And you can reach out to any of us as well, maybe LinkedIn. Oh, especially LinkedIn, Seb, of course. Seb is king of LinkedIn.
That's right.
This topic is closed now. Yes.
Well, Seb, welcome back from holiday, and thank you for bringing this topic to us. I honestly, when you brought it up to me, I was like, well, okay, fine, if that's what Seb wants to do, and I was not overly excited about it, but then you started re-energizing my Unix and Linux inner workings. Inner workings is probably a bad way to say it, but my passion for Unix and Linux and shell commands and using the shell and being smarter than the other people who just, well, not smarter, just knowledgeable, where they just don't know how to do all this stuff, which I think a lot of people are getting smarter on shells these days versus at one point we were all getting just Windows educated there for a while, and the Unix guys were just look like geniuses compared to the rest of us. But thank you for bringing this one up. And honestly, I think as we move to the cloud and start using Linux appliances for our workloads like UMS, this type of stuff becomes more and more relevant.
And to be honest, I hope that it just not only re-energized you on the Linux side, but also on the hitchhiking side. Maybe it gives you more energy to start your next vacation on that base.
Hey, I'm in New York now. I got to go up about 20 blocks. I got to get on the subway. That's risky enough for me.
Yeah.
But Seb, glad you made it back from holiday and hitchhiking or even the hiking. Hopefully you didn't do something too scary on the hiking side. Chris, as always, thanks for joining, and I look forward to talking to you guys again in a week or so.
All righty. Awesome. Take care.
Thanks,
you too, guys.